In addition to being a professor of history and politics, he's also the author of several books, most recently Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill and the Salvation of Free Government. His lecture topic is Education and Politics. Please welcome the 12th President of Hillsdale College, Dr. Larry P. Arnn.
Good morning. Is this good? Wow, that's Shapiro. I'm proud of Tim and Doug and Matt for organizing this thing, and if Mr. Shapiro's remarks cause a scandal, I'll blame it all on them. He's a massive talent, and I was so afraid when Andrew Breitbart died untimely that it would wilter away, but no. And then I walked in the room and discovered that he's 14 years old. And I'm not talking down to him if he's tempted to take it that way. If my own experience is any judge, it won't last. And I want to say, I should say, he talked about the college campus messes, and that stuff broke out in my campus one time in my knowledge. In my own class, one of my students, a boy from Arkansas, said, "Dr. Arnn, have you ever been accused of a microaggression?" And I looked at him. Richard was his name, and is his name, and I said, "Not micro." That's not our style. And I have a thought from Arnn. I'm very taken with this conference. I hope you are too. I adore that woman, and you can watch her. I've known her a long time now, and you can watch her think and learn. And she introduced a fundamental distinction last night. And it's like the distinctions that are in the classic authors between kinds of regimes. And this distinction was between Medina and Mecca, the Mecca and Medina, the phases, she says, of Muhammad's career. And then we left a question hanging, which is, how do you tell? Because there's lots of good people who are Muslims who are in the country. How do you tell? And I went away thinking about that, and I've thought of something. I think you can look at how the women dress. Because, you know, I'm married to a woman, and I like women. And I like my wife a lot, right? And one of the things about her is she's interesting to talk to. She's a free human being. And so what kind of culture shrouds them and confines them and constrains them? And that's a weakness. So I think we should watch for that. I think it's hard to get that to happen. I think a lot of them don't like it. I know the story of, you probably know that Douglas MacArthur effectively wrote the Constitution that governs Japan today. And he did it in 1945, 46. It became possible because we had leveled the country. And they would come to him, he was the Governor General, and they would give him a draft of the Constitution, and there were, by accounts, for example, in William Manchester's biography of him, that this happened 30 or 40 different conferences where they'd bring him and they'd say, well, you could change this. So basically he was rewriting the whole thing, and the sticking point was the women. He thought the women ought to vote. And their arguments, that took a long time, and their arguments were, well, they don't want to vote, they won't vote. And then they had their first election, I think, in 1947, and the women came out in droves. So I just mentioned that. That's something to think about, right? I think that's a weakness of those regimes, one of the forms of despotism they practice that probably make them vulnerable. And I think we should talk about that a lot more. So my topic is education and politics. Ben Shapiro's topic was politics on the campus, and I'm going to talk about how those politics have remade our country. And are now, in turn, it's a cycle, remaking the campus. But it started in the campus. And the connection between education and politics is fundamental in the classical time, in the time of our founding, and now, just in different ways. In classical times, what do we think? What do they think? What do they teach us? It's very beautiful what they teach us. It's the greatest single thing to study I think there is. It's what the founders of our country studied. And what they teach us is good people can't be good if they don't have good laws. And good laws can only be made by good people. So at the end of Aristotle's Ethics, which is the first book of ethics, and in my mind the greatest one that I've ever read, it's about how you get your own soul into a condition so that you can live a fully human life, so you can be fully what a human being is. And it ends with him saying, after it culminates in book 10 of the Ethics, there are 10 books, they're called, they're chapters, big chapters. At the end, it culminates in the life of contemplation shared in the individual soul, or most sublimely, among a few friends. And that's not a political thing exactly. It's beyond that. But then it turns right at the end, and it says, you can't build your character and mind, and therefore soul, to a place to enjoy that except with good laws. And so it points to Aristotle's Politics, the first real book of political science ever written, and one of the best. And at the end of the Politics, he says, and the Politics is about how you get good laws and what they are, and the various kinds of laws and comparing them, various kinds of regimes and comparing them. And he says at the end of that, good laws come from good people. So do you see the problem? What if both the law and the people is bad? It's a problem. We must not let that happen, of course. But they will tend to come into conformity with each other over time. Now, these thoughts, and it just means that education is a central activity. It is what we say to the future. If you work in a college, here's what you learn. The thing that's most interesting to them are the things that everybody needs to know. Like you can teach them welding, and I used to weld when I was in high school. I had every kind of job. I fancy I was a pretty good welder. Better waiter. Okay, college president. But that's interesting, right? But they don't know when they're 18 years old if they're going to be welders or doctors or lawyers. And so it's no use teaching them civil torts and contracts and tax law. They can get started on that stuff, but what do they need to know? They need to know, what am I? How do I be a good one of those? And so the founders, knowing that, passed the first law regarding education, national law in American history, in the Northwest Ordinance. And Article 3, it's a very fundamental piece of legislation. It's actually the first time a free government ever grew, and it invented a novel way to grow. No colonies, equal states, coming in when they get enough people. Self-government soon. It's very beautiful. But Article 3 lays out what had begun to happen in a land ordinance 2 years earlier, that one part of the public land, and only 1/36th of the western land, and think what a resource that is. It's America. And at the time that they're writing this, nobody had ever seen the other end of it and come back to tell the tale. But they start with the Northwest Territory, where Michigan is, and they say 1/36th, 35/36th of that vast land out there will be sold into private hands as rapidly as possible to serve the public good, people owning things, using them, working with them, living their lives. 1/36th was reserved to education on this principle. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged. Think about that sentence. It's beautiful, but also it's profound. What do you need to be happy and live well? It mentions both morality, religion, and knowledge as a personal good and as a civic good, and they go together. This profundity of relationship I mean, you just can't understand how important it is. Raise up the child in the way that he should go, says the Bible. The word education comes from a Latin word that means lead forth. Which way is forth? That's a value statement, right? This is the way forward. And this is how we preserve everything good, if we do that. So the new way, which was invented in America in the 19th century and in Europe a bit earlier, has remade the country, but it begins in and for education. The people who started the revolution that Bernie Sanders is attempting to advance, and about him I read, I happily don't know that much about Bernie Sanders and hope not to, but I've been learning more, and I read that he talks about his poverty and he never had a cent, and he's a graduate of the University of Chicago. Poor boy. But he got his first job to get a paycheck when he was 30 years old, and he got it from a government agency. And apparently, I read, I don't know, and as I say, I do not put myself forward as an expert on Bernie Sanders, but I read that all of his paychecks have come from such places. And where did that start? Well, the founders of the progressive movement in America are a few people, and almost all of them academics. You can read several of them, especially Woodrow Wilson and John Dewey and Frank Goodnow, in our Constitution reader, which, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have read now, but which every student at Hillsdale College reads. And I want to mention a point there about diversity, right? Because if you read the great books and the big events in history, you're going to read a bunch of stuff that doesn't all say the same thing. And so if you discipline yourself to understand those things, you involve yourself in a great argument that has operated at the peaks of human society for 2,000 years or more. And so we read those guys, right? And what do they say? And you can read them in our Constitution reader, which is online if you want to read it or buy it. And what do they say? Well, there's a revolution, they say. Everything is different now. Because what has happened is we have come to understand that our consciousness, a new word, right? It sort of means our mental climate, not weather, changing all the time, the sort of background, big furniture in our mind, the weather, the climate in our mind. And you know, the climate is, of course, warming, but except not fast enough in Michigan. That is set by the framework in which we live. But something has changed. We live in an socio-economic milieu. By the way, don't you notice when you start talking about these guys, you have to start using a bunch of stupid sounding words? Because like old words like knowledge and wisdom and virtue and good and philosophy, right? Those are terribly hard words to define, but the ability to define them, which takes years, is a great blessing to the soul, and everybody has some rough idea what those words mean. To refine that idea is to become an educated person. That's why I like to, you know, I work this trick 10 times a week when I'm in town. What are you going to major in? And they name it, and I say, what's that? They never know, you know? They're 19 years old, right? My favorite is politics, of course. I'm going to study politics. And I'll say, what's that? And they always say, well, it's governing. And I'll say, like I do here. And they'll say yes. And then I'll show them the first paragraph of Aristotle's Politics, which says that it's a different kind of rule in politics. And then they'll say, so you put that to them. And I'll say, so it's governing, right? But what kind? So it's a mess, right? It takes forever. And everything is like that, right? But then you get into this new stuff and we're just making up a whole new vocabulary, of course, to account for a new understanding of nature, which understanding means that there really isn't any nature. There's just, nature is something, in fact. It's change. Everything is change. And we are formed by this change. So you can read Woodrow Wilson and John Dewey both writing in our Constitution reader that the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence were just speaking for their time. They were victims of their, and it was good that they did that, right? But now we know better than that. They used the word obsolete in regard to the Declaration of Independence, which, remember, the time perspective of the Declaration of Independence is extremely radical when in the course of human events. Any old time, right? The laws of nature and of nature's God. And just think, once you start talking like that, it is a breathtaking, revolutionary achievement, because the Declaration of Independence is resigned to a time period. And it doesn't really even, it can't mean that it was good for its time, because its claim is it's good for every time. And if it's wrong now, it must have been wrong back then too. And that's what they really think. Now, it changes the academic task big time once you think that way. Because Frank Goodnow, who's my favorite example, and I owe to R.J. Pastrito that I even know who that guy is. R.J. has more patience than I have with reading idiots. And, but very influential idiots, you know. And so he's in our reader. And I had not ever read anything by him until I taught our Constitution course. I knew about him, and I knew a fair amount about Woodrow Wilson and Dewey. But this guy is especially good, right? And he's an academic guy. And he writes in a passage in our Constitution reader, we teachers, academics, take ourselves too seriously sometimes because we think that we are forming the student, helping them to grow and learn, but really what they're going to think in the future is going to be a product of the economic times that develop in the future. Think what a gloomy thing that is to say. You know, I'm privileged. I have students. Lots. And you know, I've been there a long time around. Some of them are grown-ups, and they're big deals. And they're starting to tell me what to do. You know, the way you do with your dad, you know, and your dad thinks it's funny at first. And a lot of them are, you know, really important people. Big places in Congress, Supreme Court clerks now, big-time lawyers, right? But why does it matter to them to tell me what to do? I'm their teacher. And you know, they don't really think they can tell me what to do. One of their favorite things, I overheard two of them saying it the other day in Washington because they were beating me up about something. And one of them was a very senior guy on the staff of the majority leader in the Congress. And I said, okay, you going to stand here and tell me all this right now? And he turned to a friend and he said, well, he's still not a tame lion, is he? There's just no estimating how much I value those people and our relationship. And they value it deeply. But what Goodnow is saying is, it doesn't matter. You see? And do you see another thing? It shifts the focus away from the knowledge that the human soul can apprehend to the work that the human soul can do upon the society and the events in it. Because if what is controlling us is all these circumstances, what if we could control the circumstance? What if we could make the economy? What if we could create our own world? What if we could create our own nature in the ways that Ben Shapiro mentioned? Then at last, we could be in control, you see, and then we could even understand, because these things that are influencing us, now at last we are influencing them. And that is the birth of the modern social sciences. And that is the birth of the bureaucratic project, which is really simple to understand. It is just the idea that highly trained people in touch with science and engaged in a kind of scientific project, like in a research laboratory, can make prescriptions in detail for the operation of the entire society, which prescriptions have to be, of course, commands to people, to what they will do. It's crazy, you know? Like the boy I'm talking about who's a big wheel in the Congress, his name Will Dunham, and he was an English major. And, you know, he has said on a video that we show sometimes when we want to pump me up a bunch, that I'm the one who turned him into what he is, right? But I just know infinitely better than that. Because there was a whole bunch of people in that class. I remember it very distinctly. And each of them had his gifts, right? And Will had very particular gifts. And I gave them, and you know, you say something, and what he repeats back to you is better. He's thinking, right? I gave him a blue book exam. You know what those are? You know, they got to write in these blue books, and they're ugly, and everybody hates them. And teachers hate to give them and read them, and students hate to write them. The process of education is a process of mutual torture. And so I read Will's blue book exam one time, and it was just great. Bunch of essays, right? And then I turned to the last page in it. He'd gone all the way to the last page, which when you look at them, you open them and look at the last page, look to the last page to see how long it is, and if it's really long, you groan, you know. And what was on the last page was a picture he had drawn, and it was a map of my mind. And the toppermost parts of my mind were the most important things, I think, and it sort of worked its way down, right? The map is accurate. I still have it, you know? And see, I didn't do that. Will did that. And I don't think the economic circumstances and the social milieu of Will did that. I think the divine spark in his soul did that, see? That's wiped out. That's gone now. And so what we teach them to do now in the university is we turn them into an engineering project. And one element of it, but it's much the weaker element, is the element of self-definition. You can have, your values can be whatever you please them to be. But that doesn't last because it's ignoble and because it doesn't make sense given the kind of thing we are, which they still have some contact with. And so what it really turns into is you have to remake the society. Ben Shapiro mentioned, you know, you get up in the morning and you decide that you're going to be one of the several other genders. We have 8 dormitories at Hillsdale College, and we divide the dormitories by sex. 8 is not enough. It's a poser we're trying to figure out, you know. But it turns into this. It's not that you can be whatever you want to be tomorrow morning. That becomes a side issue. You can make everybody else recognize that. You can remake all of our social relations. That's breathtaking and despotic, because just think, the emphasis goes away from you realizing something worthy, eternal, universal, beautiful, that it is your particular spark, being a human, to be able to do, and the fulfillment of your ultimate capacities. Now to you're working on things to change them. But the things that you're working on are people. Because we're not regulating the environment. We're regulating people. We're not regulating anything. Bernie Sanders is not going to regulate money or taxes. He's going to regulate people, and he's going to do that with a view to altering what they are. Now it comes back to the college, to the university. Oh, I should mention this first. I just said there are these, I'll rehearse, 3 profound kinds of connections. Actually, there's just 2. Between education and politics, the classical view and the view at the time of the founding of America, which are the same, and this new view, which is that the university and its scientists become a force to remake the society. John Dewey in 1916, General Report of 1916, wrote the document that founded the Teachers Union for colleges, by which we've been blacklisted for 25 years. Yeah. I didn't do it. It happened before I came, whatever it was. But he says that the purposes of the college are changed now. First of all, teaching and research are divided, which inherently they very much are not. You know, the very large number of things that I've learned in the classroom that are fundamental to stuff that I knew a great deal about a long time before I ever became a teacher, the depth that I know them with, they're huge. I've written 3 books. I couldn't have written any of them if I hadn't been teaching that stuff. Because you just learn so much when you do it, while they do, with them. That's what happens in a classroom. By the way, it's gorgeous. It's just so much fun. And it is a little aggressive, I confess. But going along with this enterprise to remake the society, there's this immediate connection between politics and education now, because education is one of the most potent electoral political forces in the land. And just think, constitutional government does not generate a lot of employees in the government. And bureaucratic government does generate a lot of employees. In fact, under constitutional government, according to Tocqueville in the 1830s, private citizens do most of it. They don't, you know, our state representative right now is a man named Lloyd Hauser, who's a car dealer in town, and his daddy was on the board of the college, and they're an old, distinguished family, and my boy Will Dunham, that I've been mentioned, is married to one of the Lloyd Hauser girls. Got her pregnant again. Eric, the state rep, told me, I met her daddy one time right after I was hired president of the college, and he died a few years later. But I was taken because he was a man of great dignity. I had to meet him before he died. And Eric told me that his father said that back in the 60s, when he was the mayor of Hillsdale, Hillsdale had 5 employees, 3 cops and 2 secretaries. Now, it's the same size town now. We're not vibrant with growth up in Michigan. It has 100 employees now. You see? Multiply times 30. That's about what's happened. So now, how many people work in education? There are, in public education in America, as of 2013, there are 3.1 million teachers, and there are 3.1 million administrators and support staff. The number in 50 years, according to the Friedman Foundation, the number of students from 1950 till 2009, 59 years, has grown 96%. The number of teachers has grown 252%. And the number of administrators and other staff has grown 702%. Now, I'll compare with our Barney charter schools. Do you know about that? So there are these 13 charter schools, right? And it's just like a classroom. It's a common partnership enterprise of mutual torture. We pay for what we do. We don't get any money from them. And we've got 5 full-time employees working on this now, and eventually it'll be 7. And a bunch of our faculty help, and we give them a curriculum, and we train their teachers, and we help them hire their headmaster, and we accredit them every year. And they come to the campus, 250 teachers last year, and they learn with each other and with our faculty, you know, who know a lot of stuff. They're very serious people. And they've got 30 years of knowledge, and they've got superb minds. So that's our part, right? Their part is they have to do what we say if they want to continue to use our name. They can stop any day they want to. None has. They have fantastic results, right? All of the ones that are 2 years old or older, they take the state standardized test, a central bureaucratic thing to try to make every kid in America learn the same thing. No child left behind. Somebody from the Bush administration came to see somewhere, I think the Hillsdale, but somewhere. John Cervini, I remember, were at the table, and he said that Bush was going to do a lot in education as he had done in Texas, George W. Bush, and I knew what he'd done in Texas. I didn't like it. And he said, we're going to do the No Child Left Behind Act, and we'd like your help. And I said, well, I don't really know what it is. I said, dumb title. And he said, it's a great title. Why not? Every child, no child should be left behind. I said, sir, you ever been in a classroom? I mean, 15 minutes? You know, I mean, somebody's always getting left behind. It's just how it is, you know, you can't stop it. And it's what Ben said, right? People are different. So we take those tests, we have to, right? In Florida, there's a big prosecution of many people in public education, and they're being prosecuted for giving the kids the answers because they get promoted and they get money if the kids do well on the test. And public schools all over America take February and March, and they cram for those tests, right? Big standardized whacking things, right? In our charter schools and in our Hillsdale Academy, I see Calvert sitting back there, we take them, have to. I think the Academy doesn't, it takes some other stuff. But the preparation is only this, it doesn't affect the curriculum at all. The announcement the night before is tomorrow we're going to take a test. All of those schools are ranked at the highest possible level, in the top tier in every state, 7 or 8 different states now, right? And what's the administrative burden in those schools? So we got 6 divided by 13. So there's, what is that? A third of a one for each one. No, a little more than half, almost half of one for each one. And then the Austin charter school I know in detail because the greatest young academic in America today runs it, my daughter. And so I know all about that place. She doesn't call as much. She's in the 2nd year now. She's not having many crises. But I know who works in there because I've been in there, right? And so it's her, and she teaches. And there's an assistant headmaster who teaches full-time. And then there's 3 people who work in the office. So we're up to 5. And there's a custodian. I think that's the whole bunch. And so add in then the Hillsdale College, half a person who constitutes an administrator. I think you've got 6.5, and you've got 40 teachers. So the ratio is 1 or 1.1 to 1 administrators to teachers in the public schools. And in this, it's 1 to about 7. What's that about? What are those administrators doing? Why is it so expensive? And see, there's an army of people who are governing and reinventing and regulating education, and they number the same or more than the teachers. Now think about what those people are like. Because, as we all know, people who work for the government don't have any interest of their own. You know, because, of course, and that, by the way, you should read Pistrito, who I happen to see sitting back there, about this, because he writes about this. They actually think that the people who work in the government, of whom, by the way, there are 21 million civilian employees, state, local, and federal, in the government of the United States today. And they're not, I mean, you know, I realize that they're strictly nonpartisan and only care for their, you know, but 14 of the top 25 donators in politics today are public employee unions. And the biggest one is the teachers union, and it's 2.5 times the next biggest one. It's an army of people. And what do they want? I think a lot of the teachers join the union because they got all these bureaucrats telling them what to do, and they want some protection. And they don't quite see that the union is sustaining and growing the bureaucracy. It's like, just like the kids in the bad schools, right? They're like captives. You know what I said about the Muslim women probably don't like it, and it's a source of weakness in people who are enemies and they're not just to their own citizens? I think there's something like that latent in education too. My dad was a school teacher. He said he found his happiness being a school teacher. My daughter is a school teacher. She says she found her happiness doing that, right? I'm a school teacher. It's a noble and fine profession. Wouldn't there be a political program to liberate those people? Let them do what they do? So now this bureaucracy, which began in the academic world and has remade the government, has become, especially when it stems from the schools, into a major electoral political force. And it has direct interest in the size and remuneration of people who work in the government. And since this is a representative government, that means there's this big old circle of society and there's a small circle of government in it, and all the sovereignty, the ultimate authority is out here among us, and all the power to act is in there in the government. If the government gets close to half the size of the country, the direct expenditure is about 40% of the GDP now. And then there's the regulatory expenditure, which is very powerful and might make up another 15%. It's harder to count. Then all of a sudden you could have a government that might overwhelm the society that is supposed to be electing it. And that started in education, and it's working its way back into it now again. So in this latest phase, I don't know if it's the last phase, all of a sudden we have these cry bullies. And what they are is 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-olds, often in very elite places where they are enjoying massive privileges. And these elite places especially are all very old, and they have been very excellent. And the demand is that they abandon what they were built to do and apologize for everything up to now and proceed in future along lines that are dictated in the tone of harsh commands. And as Ben Shapiro said, people are being fired and being humiliated. And it's astonishing to me how many of those people participate in their own humiliation. The president of one of the colleges over in Claremont, where I got a lot of my education, was apparently carrying on negotiations with these people for some months. And when the thing in Missouri broke, they made vocal their public demands, although apparently he was already giving way on them in private. And so his reaction to that, when the storm hit his campus, was he organized a sit-in in his own office. Made a public fact of that, gave them everything they want, and then presented it to the college, where some of my friends teach. Did pass the faculty. Board is apparently putting up with it. But think what that means, right? So I'll give you just one example. At Amherst College, you know what that is, right? Back in Massachusetts, very distinguished, always in the top 5 among liberal arts colleges. Students are demanding that the president, Biddy Martin, issue an apology to marginalized individuals who have been the victims of our institutional legacy of white supremacy, colonialism, anti-black racism. You're going to like this list, and I don't know what it all means. Anti-Latinx, with an X, racism, anti-Native American racism, anti-Native Indigenous racism, that's something else, anti-Asian racism, anti-Middle Eastern racism, heterosexism, cisexism. Ben Shapiro told you what that was, and I'm not sure he's right, but I don't know. What I think it is, maybe these are speculative sciences we're engaged in, right? What I think it is that I look at one of you and assume that you're a male or a female and use those pronouns for you, whereas you don't think that's what you are. Or anyway, I'm making an assumption that is a microaggression. I think it's that. Xenophobia, that's an ancient Greek word, anti-Semitism, ableism, mental health stigma, and classism, among other things. You know, that dang Amherst is a bad place. And for a long time. So what do we actually know about, I don't know anything about Amherst except it's elite. My friend Hadley Arcus taught most of his career there until he retired lately. And Calvin Coolidge went there. And Calvin Coolidge wrote an autobiography, and it contains something I'm going to read to you. It's about a professor at Amherst named Charles Garman, whom he remembers with deep reverence. And he says that you had to take Garman's course for 2 or 4 semesters. I'm forgetting which right now. And he says that the first part of it was you had to learn what it was to prove something, which, if you think about it for a minute, is hard to do. You have to learn to reason. You have to learn to use your mind. And that's a hard kind of study. We're about to implement our course in rhetoric and logic, and it's going to be pure torture. It's why the provost back there has recommended it. He said, we need to add one more course to the core. And I think his descriptive adjectives were ugly, unpleasant, grueling. He used all kinds of words like that. And of course, everybody in the room said, okay, good, let's do that. But you have to learn how to reason, right? You have to learn how to not make mistakes. And that's hard. And it gets right inside you, right? You've got to really give yourself to something like that, any high learning, but that's a particularly tough one. And Coolidge says he did that. And then he gets to the conclusions he learned from this guy, Garman. He says, our investigation revealed that man is endowed with reason, that the human mind has the power to weigh evidence, to distinguish right and wrong, and to know the truth. This, I would say, was the central theme of his philosophy. We looked upon Garman as a man who walked with God. In the fatherhood of God, we learned of the brotherhood of man. Every reaction in the universe was a manifestation of his presence. It sets man off in a separate kingdom from all the other creatures in the universe and makes him a true son of God and a partaker of divine nature. This is the warrant for his freedom and the demonstration of his equality. Would you like to go study with Charles Garman? I would. And did you know that Calvin Coolidge is the man who gave as president, the speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence? You know how it ends? We live in an age of abounding science and material progress, but the things of the Spirit come first. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights, that is final. You see? There's a thing that makes us what we are, and it makes us all what we are. And to regard any human being as a being you can abuse or put a bridle on like you can any horse is an offense against that human being. That's what they were teaching at Amherst by their most distinguished and foremost professor early in the 20th century when Calvin Coolidge went there. Calvin Coolidge gave a speech at Howard University, historically black college, you know. And it's about the equal rights of everyone of all colors. And these kids at Amherst are slandering that and destroying the legacy of that. And they've got no idea it even exists. And of course that implies, because this stuff, the cycle is now known, right? In principle, it's present in the classic works. In principle, it's present in the founding. And now it's actual among us today. What happens in the classroom makes its way into the society, and what happens in society back into the classroom. If these people graduate and they're in the best places, and they become our rulers, what's it going to be like when the laws reflect these ideas? One sees the dark hand of despotism stretching out, and it will be violent and ugly. But I'll close with this, it won't be. And I'll tell you why. Because these doctrines these kids are being taught lead nowhere good, and they are so awful compared to the lovely things that can be learned in a college. You know, our kids are smart, real smart, and they're very hardworking. And what is the story as they go through? They grow both in assertiveness and in humility, because you have to be bold and you have to push to attempt to understand the most beautiful things. But you also have to admit that you don't know, and you have to have a reverence for them. And it becomes a satisfying life that settles into one and guides it until it dies, up to the next world. This doesn't produce that. This produces resentment and bitterness and friction. It is ugly, and it cannot sustain. And then I'll just say these two things. The way out is plain, and we stand for that. And because all of this will engulf us if it engulfs the society, we may get a chance to prove that we'll stand that to the last stand. We will be praying for God to give us the strength. So far, we've found it. Thank you.
Thank you, President Arnn. We now have time for some questions. We have 2 microphones. Please wait for the microphone and fire away.
Anybody want to say anything?
Dr. Arnn. John
Yo.
Henry here.
Hi, John.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I've had a question that's bothered me quite a while, and it relates to your relationship of politics and teachings. In a humble sense, do you ever have a problem in differentiating between the human soul and your conscience?
Well,
It occurs to me as a professor and teaching, and I'm very careful when I walk that line, and I'm wondering whether or not that is shared by the eminent person in your position.
yeah, okay. So my soul is actually right over here, and my conscience is down here a little lower. Now, so I can only give you the account of a great man, great mind about that. So the human soul is it's unique. There isn't anything else like it that we see because it's attached to a body. The human soul a human being is an integrity of mind and body. It's not a mind and a body or a mind or a body, it's both. And so Aristotle imagines then that the soul must have certain attributes for it to perform the way it seems to perform. It must be, to start with, immaterial. It can't be in any place. It isn't the brain. It's connected to the body. It doesn't function that we can see when the body dies. But why does it have to be like that? Because it can reason, and what reason means is that I know that you are a man, and I know that I am a man, and I know that, there's a woman and there's a woman, and yet they're different. So we recognize essences of things, which are never the same thing as the particular thing in front of you. So how does it do that, he says? Well, it has to be immaterial. But then it has to be connected to the body because it feels passions and needs and wants, and it has to survive, pleasures and pains. The first obstacles to the practice of the character, the doing virtues, are pleasure and pain. And there's information in pleasure and pain, and you need that information. But the right disposition toward them is crucial. And the right disposition toward pain is courage, and the right disposition toward pleasure is moderation. And as you learn those things, you become freer and better able to think, among other things. So this connection to the body is profound. Now, what about this question of the conscience, which I think means the propensity to seek the good? Now, every living being, according to Aristotle, seeks its good. Dogs like to be like dogs, and horses like to be like horses, and plants like to grow up and find a space to be what they're supposed to be. That's how he describes it. But we're different because we are agents in this. And you can see, because we have volition, that is to say, we can choose things, and that too is born in this capacity to recognize common nouns, which is what reason is. You see, for me to treat you rightly only becomes a question after I know what kind of thing you are, right? Like, Millie, our boxer, is a liar and a thief. But she doesn't, she doesn't really know that she's lying, or else we'd have to put her down. But our children, when they were growing up, they could be ashamed. Still are. All of us can, right? Because you're not supposed to treat people like that. You're not supposed to take their stuff. But you can put a saddle on a horse and ride it around, and that's okay. You just can't do it to a person. You see? So these common nouns give rise to our sense of morality as well as our ability to communicate. Now, if all beings seek to be what they are, and the good is just each thing being what it's supposed to be, right? And we're agents in that. That is to say, we can choose not to. Like we human beings have a very complicated way of reproducing ourselves, and it takes a long time. Hillsdale College parents, these kids are 20 years old, and if they were some other kind of creature, they wouldn't know who the kids are, right? But they're still the center of their lives, and yet we don't have to have children. There'll be nobody to take care of us when we get old if we don't, but never mind, we don't have to. And we can have them and run off from them, or abuse them if we want to. But the point is, if we do that, unless we're insane, which is rare, we know it's wrong. So the point is, the conscience is just an element of a volitional soul seeking the good, as I understand it. How's that?
I'd like to ask this question. I see the economic problem for young people after getting an education. Their debt, economically speaking, is quite an interesting phenomenon. And I wonder whether that is going to sometime really affect education as a whole. Could you speak to that issue and how difficult it is after getting out of college and then having a debt of $100,000, $50,000, whatever the case may be? Maybe those are even small figures, I don't know. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I think it's $1 trillion now that's in student debt, and the default rates are very high, and to some extent the default rates are encouraged. Our default rate at Hillsdale College for 25 years is 1%. Been steady for a long time. That means almost all of them pay the money back, and we have a limit on how much they can borrow. We try to put together, we're in the success business at Hillsdale College. If they come, we want them to suffer and almost die, but we also want them to succeed and then get out and have great lives. So we try to put the system together so that it works for them as for us. And of course, they don't pay for most of it. You do. Thank you very much. But yeah, so what I think is college has always been expensive. There's never been a college of any quality that made its living off the fees the students pay. And there's always been borrowing associated with it. It seems to be a lot higher now. But I also think that there's way too many people going to college. And here's what I mean by that. Training, learning practical things, even elevated practical things, everybody needs to do that, and most everybody can. But this rarefied thing, you know, think of all that complicated stuff I was just talking about, right? I'm surrounded by 18 to 21-year-olds who just love to talk about that stuff. And that's really weird. And it's not of any immediate practical use, except it's the most fundamental practical thing too, teach you how to live your life. Well, it used to be that a much smaller percentage of people did that. But now the goal is everybody should do that, and so we're changing what college is, big time. So if you want to learn to be an accountant, you know, we have a really great accounting program, and we're nationally ranked in the CPA exams, you know, in the top 5 somewhere. I think I was 3rd last time. But that's a hard subject, and that's something you do in college. But, you know, I was once asked by a rich man to get involved with the Oregon Institute of Technology. And about 1/3 of their students were studying engineering, and about 2/3 of their students were learning to be dental assistants. I don't know if that's an economical way to do that. Maybe they should just go to, you know, trade school. So I think that's part of the problem. And then I do know that the government, if you take their money, they require you to spend a lot of money on things that you might not choose to, except that they require it. So that makes it more expensive. And then I know that there's a conflict of interest. And see, you're not talking to the world's leading expert on government funding of colleges. Because it's real hard to understand. And if I was doing it, I would have to come to understand it, but I don't. So this is true. How much you get from the government. There's a form, we use the form, it's called the Free Application for Federal Financial Aid, FAFSA, Federal Student Aid. And you fill out this form. And there's a number on the form, and I think it's your adjusted gross income, but I confess I don't really remember. And then a bunch of deductions come, and then there's a bottom number. And one of the deductions is need factor at the college. How much is their tuition, room, and board? And however, the lower the bottom number, the more the student can get, but the money really comes straight to the college. And the need factor, I'm told, is determined, and see, I keep repeating, I don't really know. Why would I try to find that out? But the need factor is set by the number that the board votes for tuition at the May meeting, whatever the number is. And so it doesn't matter if anybody pays it. If that number is real high, then the students are eligible for more aid, and the college gets that money. And I am told that the federal government is paying full freight, which most don't, at Hillsdale College or anywhere now. So that means that then most of the aid is loans, and that means they're buying loans. I mean, they're paying inflated numbers like that. So I think that's going on here. And I think above all, the distortions are just so great, above all, bigger than that debt question, is this question. Since I have learned that the student has to do most of the learning, which is an enormous vindication, by the way, of their freedom and their potential. It's a very fundamental thing that I've learned in my life, because I came to this college. Didn't really come to be a teacher, but I always have and do every term. And I found it a profound experience. They do it. And if they're bored or tired or inactive, they're not learning, and there's nothing you can do about that. And that means college should be a place for people who really want to go. And a high college has got to be a place where you're longing to know this thing. And this thing is a very ultimate thing. And I'm going to take years at the budding moment of my life and I'm going to absorb this and carry it with me the rest of life. And there's no financial inducement that can make somebody really want to do that. And that's why I think the solution to the problem of college cannot be just continuously pouring more money into it. Does that help? Yeah, thanks.
We have time for one last question.
Would you please address the problem that Hillsdale is going to have when college education becomes free and you're going to feel pressure to take government money to handle the tuition for the kids that come to Hillsdale? Will you address that question?
Yeah, well, you heard that. That's George Messenger, a man of science and accomplishment. So, first of all, I don't know that that's going to happen, and pray that it won't, for the reason I just said. The future, though imminent, is obscure, said Churchill. But our plan, because remember, the amount of money that our competitors, a typical Hillsdale competitor, we're told by our auditors, because, you know, we don't see the books of other colleges, we just see our own. I can tell you about our own. But our auditors put other similarly sized liberal arts colleges that they audit in a basket and compare them to us for our board every year. I thought of that. Once they just mentioned one comparison, I said, gosh, you should make that systematic. So what we think is they're getting somewhere between, well, they're certainly getting more than a third of what they call student revenues from the government. But we think they're getting total somewhere between 30 and 40% of total revenues from the government. So first of all, wow, that's millions of bucks, right? And so we can have that now. And why don't we do it? We're just stubborn as hell. And we don't want to sign that paper because they own you after that more than they're coming to own us now. So the plan will just have to be just like it is now. We have to work hard by controlling our cost and raising support to be able to afford to operate when everybody else has got all their money from the government, if that happens. I have a system for keeping up with stuff, and my particular system has levels of things. Some of them I'm working on right now, and some of them I review once a week, and some of them once a month, and I do it like that. And one of the monthly one is a question. What if tuition disappears? And you know, it is harder to collect tuition than it was 5 years ago right now. Because, you know, first of all, our standards are rising, right? So if you come to Hillsdale College, somebody else is offering you money. And so, you know, and people pay to come to our college. And we have a lot of applications and a wait list, but the yield of the tuition is not really going up. So, yeah, that's a long-term thing. And in one way, Hillsdale College is 172 years old this year, I think. I always get my numbers wrong when I do that. It's in its 172nd year is the right way to say it. And it's never been financially stronger than it is right now. But because of my job and because I love the college and think with pride of its beginning so long ago connected to Abraham Lincoln, I would hate for it to decline anywhere in sight of me. I don't want to see that. So we think about the future a lot. And I can just tell you what the tools to cope with it would be. It's just, as I say, watch your cost, raise money, be careful. And we do that all the time. I'll also add that I know, because I understand these things that I described at the beginning about the connection between education and politics. If the country is overcome by these things, the college will be overcome too. And then what do? Right? Well, what we do is, you know, I just think we have to try to do this, and I appreciate your help, and I ask you to understand this. I think we have to think like Winston Churchill in 1940. I think we have to think like Abraham Lincoln in 1861 to 1865. We don't know how it's all going to come out. We just are in control of what we do. and we have to get ready to make a stand. Wouldn't it be shameful if our country was beaten down by these awful trends that have come in rebellion against its meaning, and nobody intelligently or bravely protested about it? And even in defeat, to do that is a very high station. In fact, especially in defeat. So we try to gird ourselves up. Thanks.